The year was 1865, and the frontier stretched under a blistering sun that bleached the earth into a pale, trembling gold. Calder Hayes rode through it like a shadow dislodged from the horizon, a lean figure framed by heat ripples and dust. His horse moved with the tired rhythm of miles already lost behind them, hooves sinking into soft patches of sand that whispered beneath each step. Calder's jaw was tight beneath several days of stubble, and his eyes carried a strain that did not come from the sun. He had left the world he knew behind, riding west without a map or promise, only a hollow ache carved by memory. Every gust of hot wind carried ghosts, gunfire, screams, the shattering moment he had frozen when saving others had been possible. He rode now, because stillness hurt worse than the endless road stretching ahead beneath the sky. He did not expect to find anything living in that shimmering emptiness, yet fate often took pleasure in unveiling its harshest truths when a man least desired them. At first, it was merely a dark smudge wavering in the distance, no larger than a hawk shadow. Calder narrowed his eyes and slowed his horse, uncertain whether the shape was real or merely another trick born of heat and exhaustion. But as he approached, the outline hardened into clarity, timber posts forming a crude frame, and suspended between them, the limp figure of a woman. His breath hitched, a sudden punch of alarm breaking through the weariness that had clung to him for days. He kicked his horse into a hard gallop, the beast lurching forward across uneven ground. The woman was bound at the wrists, her head drooping, her legs trembling against the strain of the ropes. Calder dismounted before his horse even stopped, boots skidding through loose dirt as he lunged toward her. Up close he saw the brutal truth of her suffering. Wrists rubbed raw by rope, skin flushed from relentless sun, lips cracked and bleeding. She lifted her head weakly when his shadow fell over her, eyes unfocused but wide with fear, as though she expected another tormentor. Calder spoke softly, the same tone he once used to calm frightened horses, assuring her he meant no harm. His knife sliced cleanly through the ropes, and she sagged into his arms, her weight, feather-light, yet trembling with exhaustion. He eased her to the ground, shielding her from the sun with his body. Each breath she took was shallow, rattling, as though she hovered on the fragile line between life and departing spirit that hovered just beyond her reach now in this wilderness. He fetched his canteen and tilted it carefully to her lips, watching as she swallowed with desperate, trembling thirst. After a moment she managed a few rasping words, though her voice barely rose above the whisper of the wind. Her name was Lena. She tried to say more, but her body failed her, forcing her back into silence. Calder studied the ground around the timber posts, noting the fresh hoofprints circling like tracks of wolves. Whoever had done this had not gone far, and logic told him they might return. The certainty tightened his chest. He lifted Lena into his arms and carried her to the shade beside his horse, the act stirring something in him he had long believed dead, the instinct to protect, to stand between danger and the innocent, even when the odds stood bleak and the path ahead promised darker trials still today. He crouched low as a distant rumble carried across the plains. It grew steadily, the unmistakable rhythm of approaching riders. Calder's pulse quickened. He dragged Lena into the tall grass and positioned her behind a cluster of sun-bleached stones. Then he readied his rifle, every movement sharpened by the instinct honed from years surviving the unforgiving frontier. 3 horsemen crested a ridge, their silhouettes dark against the burning sky. They laughed as they rode, unaware of the eyes tracking them from below. One of them held a scrap of fabric, Lena's torn sleeve, dangling it like a trophy. Calder's jaw hardened. He wanted to stand and fire, but he knew doing so would expose her. He stayed low, breath steady, gaze fixed on the men who had suspended a stranger to die beneath the merciless sun while the land itself seemed to hold its breath around their passing now. When the riders finally vanished into the distance, Calder waited several minutes more, listening for any sign they might double back. Only when certainty settled did he ease from hiding. Lena stirred, her eyes half open, clouded with pain and confusion. Calder knelt beside her, brushing dust from her forehead with a gentleness at odds with the violence simmering inside him. He spoke her name softly, and she blinked as though pulling herself from a deep, drowning sleep. He lifted her again, securing her carefully across his horse's saddle. The decision forming in his mind was heavy, shaped by failure and the gnawing hunger for atonement. He could leave her. He could ride on and spare himself the danger. But the memory of innocent blood haunted him, whispering that this time he must not turn away from someone who needed him in this unforgiving world of dust today. He mounted and turned his horse toward the distant cut of land where a dry creek bed offered shelter. The sun hammered his back, and each step the horse took jarred Lena's fragile body, but she clung weakly to consciousness, murmuring incoherent fragments. Calder urged the horse toward the faint hope of shade, every sense alert for the return of the riders. The plains around him felt charged, as though danger seeped from the ground itself. He knew he had crossed an unseen line by taking her. Whatever pursuit followed would be relentless. Yet, beneath the weight of fear, something steadier bloomed inside him, a purpose he had not felt since before the massacre stole the life he once knew. He glanced down at Lena, her breath shallow but steady, and swore silently he would see her safe no matter the cost through every mile that lay ahead now. The creek bed offered only the illusion of safety, a shallow cut in the earth where meager strands of shade clung to the cracked banks. Calder guided his horse down the slope, boots scraping against loose gravel, and lowered Lena gently onto a patch of cool dirt. She winced faintly, breath trembling, her eyes fluttering open as though the world around her flickered like a dying flame. Calder poured a little water into his palm and pressed it to her lips. She drank slowly, exhaustion threading through every movement. The sharp lines of her face softened only slightly with relief, but her gaze carried a depth that startled him. Fear mingled with something harder, something that had not yet broken under the weight of cruelty. The silence of the frontier settled around them, broken only by the occasional rustle of dry brush or the faint cry of a distant hawk. Calder stayed alert, scanning the horizon for dust trails that might signal the riders' return. The memory of their laughter gnawed at him, fueling a quiet anger that simmered beneath the surface of his composure. For now, though, he forced his voice gentle as he coaxed Lena into speaking, needing to know what danger he had entangled himself in. She swallowed hard before answering, her words thin but steady. She had been traveling with a small wagon party, she said, heading west toward the mining settlements beyond the ridge country. Supplies were scarce, tempers sharp, and when a pair of strangers approached offering guidance through the canyon, they accepted without question. It was a decision that unraveled everything. The strangers turned on them deep in ravine, guns drawn before anyone could blink. Lena spoke of the violence in halting fragments, gunshots echoing off stone walls, shouts drowned by panic. She avoided describing the worst parts, but Calder saw the truth anyway, etched in the tremble of her hands, and the way she inhaled sharply when she paused too long. Only she had been taken alive. The men dragged her away, while the canyon swallowed the last cries of those she traveled with. When Calder asked why they had tied her up and left her beneath the sun, she hesitated, her voice dropping to an almost imperceptible whisper. They wanted her to break, she said. Fear was a currency in the frontier, and the men who took her dealt in cruelty like others dealt in coin. Her escape would have been a slow death had Calder not stumbled upon her, and she knew the men would not forgive his interference. They would come, not just out of anger, but because they believed she belonged to them now. The thought made her tremble, and Calder clenched his jaw, a renewed sense of purpose coiling tight within him. He sat back, rubbing a hand over his face, feeling the grit of dust cling to his skin. His past rose unbidden, images of blood and flame flashing behind his eyes. He had once believed himself a man capable of protecting others, but the massacre had shattered that illusion. He had frozen when his own people needed him most. Now, with Lena before him, alive, frightened, and dependent upon his choice, he felt the weight of his past bearing down with merciless precision. He could walk away. The plains were vast, and nobody would fault a stranger for refusing to die for someone else's burden. Yet, even as the thought formed, he knew he had already chosen. He could not abandon her. Not again. Not after everything he had failed to do before. As the sun dipped lower, painting the sky in strokes of amber and rose, Calder secured a small fire in the deepest pocket of shade the creek bed offered. The evening wind brought relief from the day's relentless heat, allowing Lena to breathe easier. She sat close to the fire, blanket wrapped around her shoulders, her eyes fixed on the dancing flames. Calder prepared what little food he carried, the simple gestures of survival easing some of the tension between them. When she finally spoke again, it was to ask why he traveled alone. He paused, the words catching in his throat. Telling his story felt dangerous, like opening a wound that had never fully healed. But her gaze held no judgment, only quiet curiosity. Slowly, haltingly, he told her about the small settlement he had once called home, the people he had loved, the attack that came without warning in the dead of night. Raiders descended like wolves, setting fire to homes, cutting down anyone who resisted. Calder had been on watch duty, meant to alert the town at the first sign of danger. But fear had paralyzed him, and by the time he regained his senses, it was too late. The guilt clung to him like a brand, driving him westward toward nothing in particular, as though distance itself could dull the memory of failure. Lena listened silently, her face softening. She did not offer empty comforts or platitudes. Instead, she placed a hand gently over his, the gesture brief but grounding. He realized then that her strength had endured despite everything she had suffered, a quiet resilience forged under the same unforgiving sun that burned across the frontier. She told him that guilt could not change the past, but courage might still change what came next. Her words lingered in the air, fragile but powerful, settling into a place Calder had thought long dead. As dusk deepened into night, the fire's glow illuminated the narrow walls of the creek bed. Calder stayed awake, rifle across his knees, watching the horizon for any movement. Lena slept fitfully beside him, murmuring softly in her dreams. The land around them felt tense, as though danger stalked just beyond the reach of firelight. He could feel it in his bones. The riders would return, and soon. The frontier rarely allowed debts to go unpaid. When the first distant thunder of hooves rolled across the plains, Calder stiffened. It was faint, muted by distance, but unmistakable. Lena stirred awake, eyes wide, sensing the shift in him before she heard the sound herself. Calder helped her to her feet, his voice low and steady as he promised she would not face the men alone again. She nodded, fear and trust interwoven in her gaze. Together they prepared to move, knowing the creek bed offered no safety once their pursuers closed in. The wind carried the riders' approach across the open land, each passing second tightening the knot of tension that bound them both. Calder led Lena toward the shadowed path that wound through the rocks, every instinct sharpened by urgency. Behind them, the hoofbeats grew louder, echoing like distant thunder that threatened to break upon them at any moment. The chase had begun, and there would be no turning back now. The canyon walls rose before them like jagged monuments carved by a ruthless hand, their shadows stretching long across the sand as the last light of day bled away. Calder urged Lena forward, guiding her through the narrowing passage while the echo of the riders' approach thundered behind them. Each step felt heavier than the last, though neither dared slow down. The gap ahead tightened into a crooked bend where the walls pinched so close that only one rider could pass at a time. Calder recognized the terrain for what it was, a bottleneck, a place where a man could make his stand when running no longer served him. He stopped abruptly and turned, listening to the rhythm of hooves pounding closer, dust billowing like a brewing storm. Lena watched him with a fear she fought to contain, trembling but refusing to break. He told her to move behind the fallen boulders that clustered near the canyon wall, their shapes dark and irregular in the fading light. She obeyed with a slow, reluctant step, her gaze locked on him as though memorizing the lines of his face in case the night stole him away. Calder read the meaning in her eyes, saw the unspoken plea that he stay alive. Yet he kept his expression calm as he loaded his rifle and settled into a defensive stance. The guilt of his past gnawed at him, But now it hardened into a vow he would not freeze again. If the world demanded blood to balance old sins, then let it take his before it touched her. The first rider burst into view, a snarling figure framed against the dying glow of the sun. Calder fired without hesitation, the rifle cracking through the canyon with a sound that shook the air. The man toppled from his saddle, hitting the ground with a heavy thud. Another rider charged in behind him, firing wildly. Calder rolled behind a boulder as bullets sparked off stone. The horse reared, panicked by the confined space, and the rider swore as he tried to regain control. Calder used the distraction to fire again, dropping the second man. The third rider appeared, the one who carried Lena's torn sleeve earlier, his face twisted with cold, vindictive fury. He dismounted and advanced on foot, drawing a knife as though eager for the intimacy of close violence. Calder met him halfway in the narrow gap, their bodies colliding with the force of desperation. The knife slashed across Calder's arm, sending a hot burn through muscle, but he fought through the pain, grappling the man with raw determination. Their boots kicked up sand as they struggled for dominance, each movement driven by the understanding that only one of them would leave the canyon alive. The man taunted Calder, calling him weak, saying he had no place protecting what belonged to others. The words ignited something deeper than rage, something close to redemption. Calder forced the man's arm back, seized the edge of the knife, and with a surge of strength born of purpose, twisted until the blade clattered to the ground. The man tried to lunge for it, but Calder struck him hard across the jaw, sending him sprawling. Before the rider could recover, Lena appeared, breath shaking but eyes blazing with resolve. She had picked up Calder's fallen rifle, hands trembling yet steady enough to level it at the wounded attacker. He froze at the sight of her, his bravado faltering as he registered the steel in her expression. She warned him not to move, her voice thin but fiercely controlled. Calder saw the tremor in her shoulders, the weight of everything she had endured compressing into this single moment. Yet she did not falter, not even when the man spat curses at her feet. She kept the rifle aimed until Calder stepped forward and ended the fight with a swift, final strike that dropped the man into the dust. Silence returned to the canyon, thick and choking, broken only by Calder's ragged breathing and the wind slipping through narrow crevices overhead. He staggered, clutching his wounded arm, and Lena rushed to his side, catching him before he collapsed. She eased him against the canyon wall while her hands fluttered anxiously over his injuries. Her touch was warm, grounding, filled with frantic determination. Calder assured her he would live, though darkness edged at the corners of his vision. He forced himself to stay conscious long enough to check that no more riders approached. Only when certainty settled in did he allow his body to relax, his breathing steadying under Lena's trembling hands. She tore strips from her dress to bind his wound, whispering apologies for every flinch of pain she caused. He told her there was nothing to apologize for, that she had shown more courage than most seasoned men he had known. She blinked back tears, claiming she could only act because he had given her a chance to survive. Calder managed a faint smile, the first in what felt like a lifetime, and told her that saving her had given him something too, something he had believed lost in the ashes of his past. She listened quietly as he spoke of redemption, not as a destination, but as a choice, one made moment by moment with whatever strength a man had left. Night settled over them slowly, turning the canyon into a cathedral of shadow. Lena built a small fire to warm them, its glow revealing the exhaustion etched into both their faces. She stayed close to Calder, supporting him when he tried to sit upright. He leaned heavily against her shoulder, not from weakness, but from a trust that had grown out of shared danger. They spoke little, the silence between them thick with unspoken gratitude and the fragile sense of hope that had taken root despite everything. By the time the stars emerged sharp and cold above the canyon rim, Lena had resolved that they could not linger. Calder needed real medical care, and the nearest settlement lay several miles east. She helped him onto his horse, steadying him with gentle insistence. He protested weakly, But she silenced him with a look that held more strength than her wounded frame seemed capable of carrying. She climbed up behind him, arms wrapped firmly around his waist, and guided the reins with cautious determination. As they rode out of the canyon, the air carried the faint smell of rain on distant wind. Calder glanced back, once, watching the shadows swallow the place where he had finally stood his ground. Then he turned forward, toward the faint glow of a safer land waiting beyond the night, knowing the journey ahead would test them both, but no longer doubting that they would face it together.